Hey everyone, welcome to Faith in the Folds, a podcast for ministry, biblical studies, and Christian living. I'm your host, Kevin Burr. In today's episode, I got to talk with Dr. Jim Martin, Vice President of Harding School of Theology in Memphis, Tennessee, a small but well-respected seminary affiliated with Churches of Christ and my graduate-level alma mater. Jim Martin has served in ministry for nearly 40 years across the Bible Belt, and I wanted to ask him, what's one piece of advice you'd give young ministers? The pandemic has taught many ministers not just the great value in being able to learn new skills, but also the necessity of learning new skills on the job. Jim Martin brings his decades of wisdom and experience to bear on this issue of continuing to learn and grow in ministry. If you enjoy the kinds of conversations we're having here on the podcast, would you be willing to like and subscribe to us, and maybe share us with someone you think who might benefit from this? And as always, thank you so much for tuning in today. Dr. Martin, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. I really appreciate you taking some time to sit down with us and talk to us a little bit about what we're going to get into here in just a minute. Before we get into that, though, I do want to ask, would you be willing to take just a couple of minutes to tell us a little bit about your experience in ministry, kind of what you're doing now, kind of fill us in for what's going on with you these days?
Sure. So I served in congregations for about 36 years. Florence, Alabama, almost 8 years, and Kansas City, Missouri, almost 3, and then Waco, Texas for 20 years. And I was preaching minister in those 3 churches, and came here to Harding School of Theology in Memphis 7 years ago, a little over 7 years ago, and I serve as vice president here, and that means I just do a lot of administration all day long. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's kind of what I do.
Okay, all right. And you said 36 years in congregational ministry.
Uh-huh.
All right. Well, it seems like you are definitely the right person for us to ask this question. And so, without any further ado, let's get right down into it. Dr. Martin, what is one piece of advice you would give for young ministers?
Well, I thought about this, and I don't know. There are a number of directions I could go, but here's one, and that is to know that you have learned something already, but to keep on learning. Mm-hmm. Sometimes young ministers, sometimes all of us actually, will get stuck in a certain way of learning. I'm at a seminary. In fact, I can look out my window, which is just across from me, and there's this huge library. So there's the tendency from a lot of young ministers to think that everything is found in a book. I just need to find the book. I need to order the book. And it's true, in a seminary, you're going to read a lot.
Mm-hmm. Especially with the professors that I know at that
seminary. There you go. There you go.
Yep.
And when you work with a church, it doesn't matter if you're a preaching minister or you're teaching a Bible class. I think reading is important. Mm-hmm. Okay. But there are other ways to learn besides reading. I think one of the things that's really important for a younger minister is to know, let me back up, first of all, that you have learned something. Mm-hmm. You really have. Sometimes we look around and we read the next book, or we think about a seminary professor and we think, man, I don't know anything. Well, you don't know everything, but you know something. You have learned something. But good ministers keep on learning. Well, there are books. That's good. One way we learn, though, is by learning to ask very good questions. Mm. And there are people in our congregations who know a lot about what they do. It maybe they know a lot about teaching high school. The mechanic may know a whole lot about fixing a car. The FedEx driver may know a whole lot about the layout of a city or a community. I think sometimes ministers will kind of look at people like that, and and we don't ask questions, we don't inquire, but yet we want them to listen to us when we talk. There's so much we can learn by just being curious, and asking great questions. And I've found through the years that I learned so much just by asking good questions. And so one of the ways we keep on learning is by making sure that we continue to be curious. So I could go on with that, but I'll stop. But that's one thing I would encourage younger ministers to do, is keep on learning.
I like too how you mentioned the different kinds of folks that you were likely to find in a congregation. You've got somebody in education. You've got somebody who is in a more blue collar job, like a truck driver or something along those lines. All of whom you are correct to say we would hope that they would learn something from us. So we have to find ways to learn from them. And I like how you put this, we have to ask great questions. That strikes me as a skill that, and if it's a skill, it's surely something that can be practiced. I would want to know, and I think, let me reiterate, I definitely agree with you. I think that's really valuable. What's a way that I can start, like, how can I start learning how to ask better questions?
Yeah.
Do you think?
I think that's a good question, Kevin. One thing is just to think about other people and what they might have to offer. For instance, let's say I had a high school basketball coach in my congregation. Well, he's or she, they think about motivation all the time and discipline. And I might ask, you probably think a lot about the habits of players that are improving. How do you instill good habits into these players? What does that look like? I might ask something like that. So I just might think, for instance, if I were talking to an attorney in the congregation, could you talk to me about how you deal with clients and conflict, maybe the conflict there? What have you learned? There are two or three nuggets you've kind of picked up about dealing with a client in conflict with a business, or with maybe it's a former spouse. I don't know. I just think we forget that these people, there's something they've learned or are learning.
Yeah, I can see how it's almost like I need to learn how to put myself in their shoes. If I'm understanding you correctly, if I can envision myself to some degree in their job or in their occupation or in situations that they find themselves pretty regularly, I can basically ask them to explain how they excel at the things that they do well. Do you think that's a fair assessment of how to describe learning how to ask good questions?
I think that's good. If I'm going to go back to the high school basketball coach. If the high school basketball coach were to say, well, let me just tell you, you got to practice free throws every day. That's what I tell the kids. It's not a gimme. I might ask myself, are there certain free throws I need to be practicing in my life daily? Things that I just take for granted. But if I could be intentional about what I do for 30 minutes every day, could that be a habit that could build on? What would that look like? I find that very helpful to give that some thought. That's what I'm talking about. It's just uh, just being curious enough to ask. I was talking. I'm not going to beat this to death, Kevin, but I was talking to a basketball coach, a college coach, not long ago, and I was asking him, "What do you love about what you do?" And he said, "It's the practice. Because if we can have a great practice, I can tell you what's probably going to happen in the game."
Right. Yeah.
And I thought, because a lot of ministers, we focus on Sunday. Let's just have a great Sunday.
It's the game, so to speak.
It's the game.
Yeah.
And could it be that I need to be a little more intentional about my Mondays and Tuesdays and Wednesdays, these ordinary weekdays?
Mm-hmm.
Could that be helpful if I would be a little more intentional instead of just being totally focused on the game? Yeah.
As soon as you said practicing free throws, going back to the hypothetical high school basketball coach, practicing free throws, that immediately reminded me of the church equivalent, which would be spiritual disciplines, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
And the person, the coach who drills practicing free throws with that frequency and with that intensity, that person wants their players, that coach wants their players to excel in the basics.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, shooting a free throw, right? Like, I didn't play basketball, but I've seen enough basketball to know that you can be a stud like Shaquille O'Neal and not be a great free throw shooter.
Yeah.
That does make a lot of sense. That basically what you would be encouraging them to do is, in this particular instance, find ways to excel in the basics.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah. It's also interesting too, where the college coach said that if you practice well, he's going to know. He's got a good idea of what's going to happen. That reminds me of the analogy where if you have the way to tell what is inside a jar is to bump it or knock it over, because what's inside of it will spill out. If you're practicing the spiritual disciplines well, to contextualize it for a church setting, if you're practicing the spiritual disciplines well, when you get bumped or upset or when a pandemic hits, those are the things that tend to come out. Yeah. Dr. Martin, I appreciated what you said here just a minute ago. I've been taking notes as we've been talking. You said good ministers keep on learning, and I would agree 100%. For the ministers who are not able to, very easily, or quickly, complete a degree like you could get at Harding School of Theology, or something along those lines. Do you have some suggestions for ways that you can not just be at church, not just do the things at church, but really learn while working as a minister? What are some of those other ways that you can really keep on learning as a minister, in addition to asking good questions?
One of the things I would do is what you're doing right now, and I would find some people who maybe I've heard something good about, maybe I know, and I did this for years, Kevin, and basically interview them. I would ask a person, could I buy you coffee and just ask you questions about life and your work, or lunch, and that's one way. And I've found, whether it's a Zoom call or on the phone, a lot of people are very willing to have these conversations. Man, I have learned so much just from talking with other Christian people about life and ministry. That's one route to go. Sometimes it might just be asking somebody who you respect and admire, is there one book? I can't buy a whole bunch of books, but is there one book I could read right now that could be a game changer, a life changer for me? Mm-hmm. I've asked that question before. So much is available online now.
Yeah.
To simply ask somebody, of all these websites, are there 2 or 3 that could be really helpful to a person like me?
Yeah. Yeah. Those are great suggestions. The one about the book really stands out to me. And the thing about buying a book is if you're actually going to take the time to read it, rather than just use it to decorate the shelves in your office. Mm-hmm. If you're actually going to take the time to read it, that is an investment, and would definitely be worth finding a trusted individual to get their opinion on something that, will take some time. It's a little bit easier with audiobooks, but it will definitely take some time. May I ask, since you had asked that question before, can you think off the top of your head, what were one of those 2 book suggestions that you got in the past that that you would still end up recommending today? I didn't give you a heads up about that question ahead of time, so
that's all right.
Sorry to spring that one on you.
It's all right. Well, at one particular time in my life, when I was a very young minister and I was completely overwhelmed because I couldn't say no to anything I thought. Mm-hmm. Somebody suggested, you need to read Gordon MacDonald's book, Ordering Your Private World. And I read that book, and boy, I began to think a whole lot about what was making me tick and why I was doing what I was doing. That was one moment like that. Somebody suggested one time, if you've never heard of John Dickson, who is an Australian church historian who can actually communicate in very clear English that people can understand, you need to read John Dickson. And I started reading John Dickson, and I would look up his YouTubes, and I would hear him talk, and I just remember being at home or in my office there in Waco thinking, man, this is so helpful. That's what comes to mind just off the cuff.
Yeah. I'm intrigued by this book that you mentioned. I'm not sure that I caught the title all the way. How to Order Your Private
That's
World?
Close. Okay. Ordering Your Private World.
Ordering Your Private World by
Gordon MacDonald.
Gordon MacDonald.
Right. So, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, I apologize. McDonald.
MacDonald.
Oh, okay. Yeah, like the restaurant. Mm-hmm. Great.
Yeah, and it's I can't remember when it was published. Now it's been around a while, mm-hmm. But basically, the principle is as true today as it was true then, and that is that far too many of us pay so much attention to our external world. Do people notice me? Do people respect me? Do people think I know some things? Do I look like I know what I'm doing? All that stuff that sometimes ministers will pay attention to while we neglect our interior life. And yet it's that internal life, Jesus, said that, it's out of the heart that you see who a person really is. And, mm-hmm. And so, I learned in my marriage that, part of being a good husband is paying attention to what's in me, because that's going to affect the way I treat Charlotte. It's going to affect the way I treat my children, the way I talk with our elders. And so that particular book helped me make a real shift to paying a lot more attention to the baggage that I had brought into my ministry. Anyway, I could go on with that, but
yeah. Well, I definitely see some influence of those ideas about paying attention to your internal world. I definitely see some of those ideas in the encouragement note that you send out pretty regularly. Yeah, for our audience who aren't aware, is it monthly or bi-monthly?
Every 2 weeks.
Okay, so every 2 weeks.
Every Monday morning. Monday mornings, every 2 weeks.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Martin sends out what he calls his encouragement note, and it's a series of, short sayings, some encouraging thoughts. I really find very valuable the articles that you link to, because those are things that I benefit from, but otherwise would not have found on my own. There was one, I can't remember exactly what it was about, but I remember at the time looking that up and thinking, man, wow, this is really good. And I think I might have even shared it with I shared it with one of our ministers on staff.
Okay.
It was the article. I'm starting to remember now. It was the article that was about not trying to guess who's mad at you or how many people can be mad at you or something like that.
Kathleen Smith.
Yeah. That one. I sent it to one of our ministers on staff because it was appropriate for them to have at the time. And but I let me ask this. This book by McDonald that you've mentioned, he calls it, he describes it the interior world or internal world. Is that what we would call today mental health?
Yeah, somewhat. It also involves just the health of your soul, but mental health, emotional health. Like right now, this has been a very difficult season for a lot of ministers. And one of the things I do is I work with a group of ministers regularly for a period of 5 months, and then I'm in one-on-one conversations with ministers literally every week. And we wrestle with some of the challenges of how in the world do you stay calm or calmer in a culture and in a church that is highly anxious? How do you stay connected to people who disagree with you, or you just find it hard to get near them, close to them, whatever? How do you stay connected emotionally? And then how do you get clear about who you are and what you think, while at the same time you allow people the freedom to think for themselves? So anyway, and a lot of that, it has to do with what in the world is going on within me, because I wrestle with anxiety like anybody else. I'm constantly going to Jesus and saying, oh, Lord, carry this problem, carry that problem, because it's over. But it doesn't mean that as a person that my anxiety just disappears. When I get into the challenge is not to make it go away. The challenge is to notice what's going on within you and to bring that to the Lord and to make a decision about how can I function more calmly instead of letting my raw emotion take over in this next conversation.
Yeah.
So
that has been an incredibly valuable lesson that I especially learned during the early stages of the pandemic last year.
Yeah.
There were all of these stressors related not just to the pandemic, but but also a situation where we were, without going into a lot of detail, we were victims of identity theft or attempted identity theft, and found out about it the week before my wife was put on furlough.
Oh my!
And then just 2 weeks before that, tornadoes hit Middle Tennessee, and my folks lived less than half a mile away from from a house that or from a church that got ripped in two. And I mentioned this in an earlier episode of the podcast. I guess because I've mentioned it now in 2 out of the 3 episodes that we've had, I guess that must have affected me, even though I wasn't in Middle Tennessee. But the overwhelming majority of my family is still in Middle Tennessee.
Sure, absolutely.
And so I needed to realize that I had to pay closer attention to what was going on inside, because I was wrongly expressing that anxiety. And I think in the last year, I hope at least I've gotten a little bit better at that, because I've been able to, just go ahead and tell my wife, for example, hey, I'm feeling really stressed out about something and I don't know what it is. And then just in the moment, we'll kind of start talking through it. And that's been really helpful for me. And I never even knew that was a normal thing to do, or at least a good thing to do.
Oh, Kevin, I mean, just the other night, I was talking to my wife, Charlotte, about just some things I'm grappling with at work. And at one point, she looked at me and she said, do you realize that when you get anxious, you figure out ways to make yourself even busier than you already are? I said, and I could feel myself begin to get defensive. I said, what do you mean? And she said, well, you just said yes to this invitation and yes to this deal and yes to that. And she said, all I'm saying is I've been married to you for a long time. Every time you get highly anxious, then it seems like you also get highly busy. And she's exactly right. That was a way of, it's an unhealthy way of trying to cope with anxiety. By, if I could just stay busy, I don't have to think about it.
Oh man, yeah. I had the opposite problem in college, where when anxiety struck, I would take a nap, and then I would wake up having not done any of the work that I was avoiding. And feel more stressed out.
And what you just said, Kevin, and for anybody listening, the problem is not so much the taking naps or the getting busy. The problem is when I don't see that. And I'm just thinking I'm okay, while everybody else knows that there's a pretty anxious person here. And so part of what we do with anxiety in ministry, in the churches, or just as in our marriages, if I can just begin to pay attention to what's going on internally, that can really be helpful.
Yeah. I found that to be especially valuable, even in the midst of, say, for example, a tense conversation. That gradually, if I begin to, I think there's a term for it. If I'm misusing this term, I apologize. Differentiation, maybe.
Yes. Yeah.
Where I become aware of, first off, I just have to believe, okay, this tense conversation is happening. When you're in ministry long enough, as I'm sure you well know, or in a lot of occupations, those conversations happen. Not all the time, thankfully, but they do happen, sometimes more often than we'd like. The first couple of times that happened to me, I was surprised and just so taken aback that I I was more shocked and couldn't gather my thoughts. But eventually, I got to better at being able to gather my thoughts during that process,
Mm-hmm.
and really started to pay close attention to. Okay, I'm processing what they're saying. I'm listening to what they're saying. I'm aware that my anxiety is wanting to skyrocket, but if I can remain calm, that's going to make everything
Mm-hmm.
else go better. It's not an easy practice for sure, but I found it to be incredibly useful.
Yeah. Yeah. You use the word differentiation. That for what we're talking about, it comes right out of family systems. And basically, what it means is, how do you be a healthy self? One of two things is going to often happen. We're either going to start acting pretty interesting based upon our own, because of our own anxiety, or somebody else's.
Mhm.
If you've ever gone into you were just doing fine, and then you showed up at this meeting, oh my goodness, all these people highly anxious, you know, and so the question is, now what are you going to do with that? The healthy self, I look at a group like that and I go, everybody's pretty anxious in here. I need to think about what I say, my tone of voice. What I try to do sometimes is I'll lower my voice when I'm in a setting like that, and I'll actually speak more slowly. And so, in a sense, I may feel some anxiety inside, but I'm trying to have a calmer presence. And that's, a healthy self is just one of the aspects of a healthy self is you don't let anxiety just take over, because it's looking for a way to take over.
Yeah. That lends itself well to an interesting application to what you had something you had mentioned earlier about learning how to say no. I know the original context of that was about learning how to say no to all the other demands on your time. But I think you could still apply that principle of learning how to say no to anxiety here in this situation, recognizing it, and then going through the steps to it's basically not to give it a foothold.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the things I'll do sometimes, like with Philippians 4, is I will just kind of think about the passage, and I'll think, Lord, I know you're near, and yet I'm acting like it's all me. I know you're near, and Lord, I need you to take this problem, this mess, and take the way I'm feeling. And what I've found is, if I can kind of get outside of myself and start thinking like that, it's not a quick fix, but it sure is helpful. And I'll pray and thank the Lord that He's with me in all of this. I find that very helpful.
Yeah. My oldest brother, for a long time now, has been a high school teacher. And at the different schools that he has taught, he's been the volleyball coach. And wow. I don't know if I doubt this analogy originated with him, but I'm crediting him because he was the first person who I remember hearing say this, is that for his team, he always told them, be a thermostat, not a thermometer. For them, it was up to the six girls on the court to set the pace of the game, to dictate the flow of the game, to be in control, not to reflect the frantic pace of whatever the other team was doing. I have tried in so many different ways to incorporate that idea in my life, in ministry, school settings, and even especially in family settings, where if I happen to be the kind of person that can more easily sway the tone of the conversation or the day or something along those lines, then I just need to do my part to make sure that, or to ensure that I'm not bringing unnecessary anxiety or stress or anger or something along those lines to the people around me.
Mhm. That's right. You can't control other people, but you can manage yourself by the grace of God through the power of the Spirit. You can manage yourself. In a church setting, one of the best things a minister can do is to be very serious about your own transformation into the image of Christ within the context of the church, and to manage your own behavior. If everybody else is just going bonkers with anxiety, I can't fix these people. I can't solve all this, but I know that I can be a calmer presence.
Mm-hmm. That's especially valuable these days because kind of a real world example of that. Just earlier in the month, the governor of Texas made some comments about lifting restrictions for COVID, and churches all over the state are now going to start asking the questions, okay, what next?
Mm-hmm.
And in the conversations that I know are being had by folks, not just in Texas, but other states around who are anticipating similar kinds of things. One of the best things that I've seen is folks saying, yeah, we can't control what everybody else is going to do. We know what we can work with. We know how we can continue to operate, and we're going to monitor and adjust as necessary. And we're going to carry on. And that's such a relief to have that kind of attitude for something as serious as, lifting restrictions and figuring out how to get back to church safely and so on. Yeah.
I love the tone of that, Kevin. That's very good. It's a very different tone than kind of an either or they're going to dig in their heels, we'll dig in our heels. Rather, in our judgment, this is the route we need to go for now. We will monitor and adjust. Yeah. I mean, that sounds very healthy.
Yeah. Dr. Martin, as we near the end of our time together this afternoon, let me ask, is there anything else that you would want to mention, maybe not necessarily to just young ministers, but maybe also to ministers who are, maybe in their 30s or so, and they've been doing ministry for 10 or 15 years, considering this larger group of folks? Is there anything else just really pressing or that came to mind in the course of our conversation that you want to share before we break for today?
Oh, I guess I would just add that if you've done this for a while, like I have, you've done this for a while, it's so important that you periodically reinvent yourself. The longer you serve a church, the easier it is to get stuck in a rut, and you keep doing the same things the same way, and you quit learning and quit growing. And sometimes it's just important to reinvent yourself, to learn something brand new. Sometimes to put yourself in a new ministry situation. Sometimes to start something new, like a podcast that you've never done before. And
there's a lot of that going around.
Yeah, and when you put yourself in a situation where you don't, when I left Waco, I'd served that church 20 years. Mm-hmm. It was time for me to do something else. I still wanted to serve the church. I still wanted to serve ministers, especially. So when I came here to Harding School of Theology, there was a learning curve. I had a lot to learn. That was invigorating. Mm-hmm. It made me vulnerable. I was no longer this expert that had done something for 20 years. I was just learning. And I think it's helpful if periodically you can reinvent yourself and learn something new. I don't care how old you are. It's not too late to do that. Mm-hmm. So that's what I would add.
I can definitely appreciate that. I had mentioned in a previous episode with the guest that when the pandemic hit about a year ago, mm-hmm. it especially at smaller churches, but it seemed like at most churches, preachers, pastors, ministers of all shapes and sizes, they all had to become TV producers overnight. They had to figure out, okay, how are we going to do this? And mm-hmm. It was actually, despite all the annoyance of not being able to be in church like usual and just everything was different, it was actually invigorating to me. Mm-hmm. Said, okay, I'm gonna use. I know how to use these basic softwares, applications that come with my mm-hmm. computer. I need to think about lighting. I need to think about microphone. Okay, and then gradually I started tweaking the setup to where I started using my own phone. Bought mm-hmm. a small microphone, and just gradually I learned in the process. And in the grand scheme of things, that's a smaller scale significant in terms of significance application of the principle that you've mentioned here. But I think that's absolutely valuable.
Absolutely.
For us, and it really goes back to something that you said earlier. Good ministers keep on learning. Reinventing yourself is, and I think, another expression of continuing to learn.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Very good.
Dr. Martin, thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Faith in the Folds. I have really enjoyed our talk today, and it's also some degree affirming because you politely mentioned starting a new podcast, as a way in which one can reinvent themselves or continue learning. Mm-hmm. That is precisely how I pitched, having you on the podcast in the first place. I'm a young minister, in terms of years of experience. I don't know if 35 counts as young, but in terms of years of experience, I'm a younger minister, and I want to learn. So I figured one of the best ways to learn would be to ask, and hopefully we'll continue to ask good questions, like you mentioned earlier. So, Dr. Martin, thanks again.
Oh, I'm honored to be with you, and I've enjoyed it very much. Thank you, Kevin.
All right, take care.